Enjoy this tour of one of the scariest U.S. cases. Today, we'll discuss 1944's Appalachian Mountains incident, when people who crossed the vast forests still considered civilization a distant dream. Where are you watching? Comment below. After hearing what I'm about to say, would you hike these trails alone? Mountains in Appalachia. From Georgia to Maine, they span 14 states and over 2,000 miles. This mountain range was more than a physical barrier in 1904. Complete communities lived there alone, following their own rules, away from the law and the rapidly growing eastern cities. Its own world. No paved roads crossed these mountains then. The narrow, muddy paths were surrounded by old trees whose trunks blocked the sun. Around noon, your journey required days of hiking, cold nights in makeshift camps, and a constant sense of being watched. Travelers and traders disliked Western Virginia's McDowell and Mercer counties. People were said to have disappeared off the trails, as if swallowed by the forest. 0 bodies were found. Screams were absent. Only a thick, unsettling silence that sped up the living. Their speed, always looking back. Locals would look away and change the subject when asked. The mountains had things best left alone, and people who asked too many questions were told to leave before dark. A young man named Thomas Harland left West Virginia's mountains for Kentucky in fall 1944. Thomas, 23, was from a Pennsylvania farming family. He saved money working hard in coal mines for 2 years. His goal was simple. You must travel to Pikeville, Kentucky, where a distant uncle promised to hire hard-working young men to build a railroad. Thomas couldn't afford the mountain train show. Traveling along the old Appalachian trails was the shortest and riskiest route, saving him almost 3 weeks and a lot of money. Thomas left Bluefield, West Virginia, after 2 days. He ate and chatted with travelers. Tourists. He first heard forest whispers in a dark, damp tavern, with tobacco and beef stew. After seeing Thomas with a simple map, the old man with the gray beard and shaking hands approached him. No name was given by the old man. He put his rough hand on the boy's shoulder and said something Thomas would never forget. Never walk alone at night. Avoid answering dark calls. And never stay with strangers who offer accommodation unexpectedly. Thomas laughed at the shout. Young, he was strong and hard-working. His grandfather's hunting knife was with him. He believed that superstitious people who had never left their villages and were afraid of everything new made up stories about ghosts and forest creatures. Thomas left Bluefield early the next morning in the fog. We're full of good things. Thomas traveled 2 hiking days were full of good things. Thomas traveled steadily, stopping only to drink from frozen streams and eat stale bread. The thick forest was safe during the day. He saw squirrels and heard unfamiliar birds chirping. Running through the branches, he sometimes saw deer look at him before disappearing into the trees. Nightly, Thomas lit small fires and curled up in blankets with his knife. The Appalachians had a beautiful night sky. The stars seemed so close he could touch them. 3rd day morning changed. Thomas noticed he wasn't hearing forest sounds. None of the birds sang. No pets moved through the bushes. Even the wind seemed dead, leaving the air heavy and still. He continued walking, but feeling unwatched was uncomfortable. His sharp turns made him think someone was behind him, but he only saw trees and shadows. The map showed him near Elkhorn, a small town. He could get more food and sleep in a barn in this town before continuing. It wasn't an Elorn town. A group of 12 decaying wooden buildings. A store post office and steeple-free church existed. Thomas arrived late in the afternoon as the sun set behind the mountains to find a colorful sky. Streets were empty. No children played. Women chatted on porches, or men worked. Silence and a nagging suspicion that something bad had happened there. Even though the house doors were locked, Thomas saw some windows broken from the inside. It looked like someone was trying hard to enter. They tried to escape. He rang the shop's bell. No one answered. He knocked again, louder, and heard slow steps approaching. The door opened slightly, and dark eyes doubted him. The middle-aged woman had deep lines and a fearful expression that Thomas couldn't understand. He requested money for food and lodging. She shook her head but whispered after thinking, "Payment," and closed the door quickly, payment, and closed the door quickly. Thomas had trouble sleeping that night. Due to loose boards, the old barn behind the church let cold night air in through all the cracks. Thomas tried to sleep on a pile of dry hay, blanketed, but he couldn't. Wouldn't appear. The place had major issues. He felt silence like a stone on his shoulders. Nobody heard crickets or owls because it was so quiet. He lay there watching shadows pass through the wood cracks. The moon's soft light rising cast shadows. Around midnight, Thomas heard something that made him heart race. Slow, heavy steps around the barn made the sound. They weren't animal tracks, they were. Someone made deliberate footsteps around the building, searching for something. To listen, Thomas held his breath and gripped his knife tighter. Before the barn door, the steps stopped. The silence was long. A man's voice came from outside. The voice sounded distant or like someone who hadn't spoken in years. Thomas Harlan was called. 3 times it got louder. Thomas didn't reply. I remembered the Bluefield Tavern old man's words. Avoid answering dark calls. He remained still and held the knife tightly, turning his knuckles white. After several calls, the voice stopped. The footsteps resumed and slowly moved away until they disappeared. Thomas spent hours not relaxing or sleeping. He closed their eyes until the first sunlight lit up the inside. Barn through tree gaps. Thomas left the barn for the Elkhorn exit trail quickly when it got light. He turned and left. He never sought out the woman who fed him the night before. He kept walking faster until the small settlement behind him disappeared into the trees. Not much relief followed. Thomas knew he was being watched as he walked the trail. He saw no one but. He could hear branches snapping behind him, but they were always the same distance away, like someone was following them. As the trail climbed the mountain, it became steeper and harder. Thomas wanted to keep going despite being tired. The sun was high when he reached a rocky plateau with a valley view. He saw it then. The trail behind him had a figure walking in the same direction. Though far away, it was a person. Thomas sat, chose to wait on a rock. No need to worry if it was just another traveler. As the minutes passed and the figure approached, Thomas realized something was wrong. Their movements were strange and stiff, like they had to work hard every step. Thomas could see the figure's face up close. The tall, thin man wore old, torn, dark clothes. Face was pale, almost gray, and eyes were hollow and sunken. He looked rested. I didn't sweat or have trouble breathing on the steep climb. He kept moving forward, staring at Thomas. Young man got off rock and yelled at man, but he didn't respond. He walked away, getting closer. Tom was scared. He fled after getting his pack. He ran as if never before. Gasping for air, they fell over rocks and low-hanging branches without stopping. The trail blurred before him. Not turning, but he knew the pale man was still after him. He heard footsteps behind him. They never changed speed, they just maintained that mechanical, unnatural rhythm. Thomas ran until he collapsed. He kneeled, coughed, and vomited bile. Then footsteps stopped. Thomas slowly rose and looked around. He was alone on the trail. The pale man vanished. Thomas didn't light a fire that night. Hidden under rocks, he put on. The cold and fear kept them shaking as they stayed there all night. His ears were filled with strange sounds, like laughter from multiple sources. Something big was moving through the trees and breaking thick branches. The voice calling his name again was closer and whispered. Thomas covered his ears and closed his eyes. His first prayer in years was for the sun to come out, to rise soon. Thomas was sick and hallucinating at dawn. His body felt the effects of staying up all night. He kept shaking hands. Despite fatigue and vision problems, he kept going. Staying here guaranteed death. He forced himself to walk after eating Elhorn's wife's nuts. The last of his canteen water was sipped. The trail descended the mountain into a deep, foggy valley. What the map showed. The valley bottom had a river. He could reach Hazard, Kentucky, 12 miles down the river. The descent was harder than the ascent. Thomas repeatedly hurt his knees and hands on the slippery ground due to humidity. He once fell and rolled down the slope a few meters. His body stopped when he hit a thick tree trunk. Despite his pain, he couldn't stop. He struggled to stand and kept falling. The fog thickened as he approached the valley bottom. He could only see a few meters ahead. Walking through a cloud obscured your path. Thomas found the cabin in fog. It appeared suddenly, out of nowhere. The small, rustic building had a thatched roof that was falling apart and badly joined logs. Smoke from a crooked chimney indicated occupants. Thomas was unsure. He reconsidered the old man's words. Never accept free lodging from strangers, but he was sick, desperate, and lost in the fog. We had to aid him, a clean place to rest and clean water. He knocked 3 times at the door, despite his nature not to. The door opened immediately, as if someone was waiting on the other side. The doorway was entered by an elderly woman. She was short, hunched, and had shaggy white hair. She had hair and a few-toothed smile. Her eyes were bright and lively, and she stared at Thomas with disturbing intensity. She said nothing. She invited him in by opening the door and waving her hand. Thomas looked inside. He could smell unidentified herbs from the fireplace's full flame and pot over it. Despite his uncertainty, he continued. Thomas saw something that changed him. It chills me. Immediately he saw something on the cabin floor, partially hidden under a rough-hewn table. Same canvas backpack as his, but old and stained. A worn-out pair of men's boots was also there. When Thomas looked up, the old woman saw him. Her smile was replaced by a cold, calculating look. She approached him without speaking. Thomas noticed other people. Noises come from inside the cabin. He heard slow, shuffling steps from an unseeable room. Thomas sped away and nearly tripped. Turning around and running again felt like he was back in the thick fog. He heard the cabin door hit the wall and several feet leave the cursed building after him. Not just the old lady. There were more people inside, and they wanted him. Thomas ran blindly through fog and crashed. Into trees, tripping on rocks, getting up, continuing. His fast heartbeat made him think it would burst. His lungs ache. Fear made him move even though his brain barely moved his legs. After Thomas reached a lower valley, the fog lifted. He was running along a narrow stream through the trees now that he could see better. Dark water rushed over moss-covered rocks. Thomas halted. He rested against a tree and listened for quiet. Only running water broke the silence. After holding his breath for a few minutes, he looked back. Nobody was there. Even though the trail behind him was empty, Thomas knew he couldn't trust what he saw. The trees could hide those people, or whatever they were, ready to strike at any time. He followed the stream, hoping it would join the larger river on his map. The rough path with loose rocks was dangerous to walk. Thomas repeatedly slipped and fell, soaking his boots and pants. The cold water soaked through the fabric and hurt his feet. He followed the stream's winding path for hours, listening for sounds and people. Thomas became more depressed as the sun set, thinking about spending another night in that scary forest. As the forest got dark, Thomas found a natural opening between two big rocks. He stuffed himself inside, making it too small to move. Plus, it shielded him from sides and back. Someone could only reach him from the front, where he could see it and use his knife to defend himself. Due to cold and fatigue, he huddled there, staring into the pitch blackness. No moon and clouds blocked all stars that night. Thomas had never seen or felt anything so dark. They entered darkness. Thomas didn't expect them. He only heard them. Many slow-moving footsteps in the forest were spread out, suggesting someone was looking for them. Thomas held his breath and pressed harder against the cold rock behind him. Hearing footsteps got closer. He then heard voices. Many people spoke a strange language he couldn't understand fully. The whispered words were unsettling and hard to understand. They spoke differently from most people. It seemed robotic and fake, like they were copying human language without understanding it. Someone passed by Thomas's hiding place so close that Thomas could have touched its clothes. In the dark, he saw a tall, thin figure moving with the same strange stiffness. He noticed something in the pale trailman. The figure paused and slowly turned its head, as if inhaling. Thomas closed his eyes and prayed within, hoping the darkness would protect him. The figure kept walking and joined the forest walkers after what seemed like forever. The sounds faded until they were gone. After entering the hollow, Thomas waited for dawn. He hadn't. No sleep. Though alive, his body was numb from the cold and bad position. He had trouble getting out of his hiding place because his joints hurt and were stiff. He needed clean water and food quickly to survive. Though the stream was nearby, Thomas didn't want to drink from its dark, shady water. He continued along its path, hoping to find a clearer spring or the main river. The day moved slowly. Thomas marched mindlessly like a robot. He didn't want to quit because it meant giving up. He started seeing dark spots and tripped randomly. His fever rose overnight, causing severe chills and hot flashes that made him sweat. He knew he was sick but could not stop walking. Stopping here would kill him. He needed assistance. He had to reach town. It was now or never to leave those mountains. In the afternoon, Thomas heard a sound that gave him hope. The roar of a large river was the sound. He followed a stream for a long time, and now it joined something bigger. When Thomas told his legs to speed up, they moved slowly. He emerged from the trees to find a wide, rough river with brown water, rapidly flowing between steep rocks. The river was on his map. Keep going northeast, and you'll reach a town. Thomas noticed something else. 3 figures on the other side of the river watched him. Thomas could see that stiff, unnatural posture from afar. It was them. They arrived before him. They may have found faster routes through the forest not on the map. The 3 figures stood and stared, then slowly followed Thomas along the other bank. He realized they would find him no matter how far he ran or hid. They always followed him, waiting for him to pass out from exhaustion and can't stand. While walking along the riverbank for hours, Thomas kept an eye out for the 3 people. Never got closer or farther. They patiently followed him. Hunters who know their prey tire. The sun set again, and Thomas felt hopeless. He couldn't last another night. His body was exhausted. He needed immediate aid. He noticed smoke. There were several smoke columns in the distance, indicating a village or small town with multiple chimneys. Thomas was so hopeful he almost cried. He pushed himself to move his legs faster despite every muscle hurting. Along with them, the figures across the river accelerated. Thomas misjudged the smoke column's distance. It was much farther than expected. The sun kept setting as night fell, filling the forest with long, scary shadows. Thomas walked on. Though he fell several times, he always got up and continued. Smoke clouds approached. Finally, as night fell, Thomas. The lights of a small town appeared before him as he emerged from the last group of trees. There were lamps in the windows of homes, people walking down the streets, and normal people laughing and talking. Thomas almost knelt in gratitude. He did it. He escaped. He quickly checked back, but the three were gone. The other side of the river was empty and dark. Thomas didn't wait to locate them, just turned. He ran as fast as he could toward the city lights. Prestonburg was on the Levissa Fork River in eastern Kentucky. About 800 people lived there. Thomas stumbled on Main Street. His clothes were ragged, and his face was pale and sweaty. Many people stopped to look at him, worried and curious. A woman dropped her broom and ran to him on her porch to check for injuries. Thomas replied, but his words were muddled. His legs gave out from disorientation, falling onto the dirt street. He last saw worried people hunching over him and calling for help before passing out. Thomas woke up in a small, clean room 2 days later. He lay on a soft bed with soap-scented white sheets. He was stunned before realizing where he was and what had happened. He woke up dizzy and was pushed back into the pillows by firm but gentle hands. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair and round glasses wearing simple, clean clothes. He identified as Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town doctor. Thomas arrived thirsty, malnourished, and feverish from an infection. He was taken to the doctor's house where he passed out and talked meaningless things about people in the mountains and voices in the dark for 48 hours. The doctor said Thomas was lucky, was a blessing for his thirsty throat. The warm food was a blessing for his thirsty throat. The doctor repeatedly asked him about his past and where he had been during his meal. Thomas paused before responding. Not sure if he should be honest. Who would believe him? Their plan was to likely think he's insane or that the fever drove him insane. Their confidence came from Dr. Morrison's eyes. Thomas then spoke. He recounted his journey from Bluefield to Elkhorn, the quiet village, the pale man who chased him along the trail, the foggy cabin, and the toothless old woman. The voices in the dark, the people who followed him to the river, and always being there were discussed. Something else. After a while, something else. After a while, Dr. Morrison looked grave and worried. After Thomas was done talking, the doctor was quiet for a long time and looked out the bedroom window at the street, where people were going about their normal lives. He finally let out a heavy sigh and said something that made Thomas's heart beat faster again. The doctor. It was said that Thomas wasn't the first traveler with a similar story to show up in Prestonburg. At least 6 other people have made it across those mountains in the past 10 years and lived to tell about scary things that happened to them deep in the forest. These stories all fit together in a certain way. They always involved travelers who were on their own, happened in the same remote areas between West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, and were about humanoid figures that seemed to hunt travelers on purpose and in a planned way. The doctor got up and moved over to a bookshelf where he kept different papers and medical books. After a short search, he found what he was looking for, an old notebook bound in leather that he used to keep track of strange cases he had seen over the years. He took out his notebook, opened it to a page that was marked, and started reading out loud. In October 1896, a merchant named Joseph Blake came to town in the same situation as Thomas. He said he was being chased by people who were moving erratically, like puppets, had just gotten out of a cabin where she had been held for 3 days by people she said were not really human. Margaret's mind never fully recovered from what happened, and she was eventually sent to an asylum in Lexington. 2 brothers arrived at the same time in June 1911, both hurt. They told of an abandoned town where they found disturbing evidence. There were also more cases, some with more than one person. There were also more cases, some with more details than others, but all with things in common that made them impossible to ignore. Dr. Morrison put down his notebook and looked at Thomas straight on. He said that those mountains were very dangerous, and that the authorities there chose to ignore the problem. He had tried more than once to tell the sheriffs of. He had tried to get help from neighboring counties, but he was always politely told to shut up or treated like he was believing weak superstitions too much. No one wanted to look into it. No one wanted to send men into those forests to look for answers because the answers might be better off not being found. The Appalachians were very big, very old, and had many places that no one had ever been. Who knew what was hiding down there? It gave Thomas a chill down his spine. He asked the doctor if he really thought the figures were some kind of a non-human being. The doctor thought for a moment before answering. He said that as a scientist he was trained to look for explanations in everything. He did say, though, that science still couldn't fully explain some things in the world. They might have been people who had lived alone for so many generations that they had changed how they looked and behaved. They might have been mentally ill people who got out of a mental hospital and were now living like wild animals in the forest. Or maybe he lowered his head. Voice, as if they were afraid of being heard. Maybe they were really something different, something that was on the edge of what people could understand. Thomas stayed at Dr. Morrison's house for 5 more days and got stronger. For a long time, he talked with other people who lived in Prestonburg and learned that many of them had stories about the mountains. Through the years, stories had been passed down about things that lived deep in the forest and looked like people, but weren't. The natives people who lived in these areas before European settlers avoided certain areas because they thought they were cursed or home to evil spirits. People who came to the area early on learned quickly to pay attention to these warnings when several families went missing. Nathaniel Cross, an old hunter who had been exploring the mountains for 50 years, told Thomas something very scary. Nathaniel said there were places in the forest where animals just wouldn't go. Deer avoided these areas even when they were being chased by hunters. There were no nests of birds there. Not even bugs seemed to be around. These were dead zones, or places where nature had gone away. Nathaniel said that in the middle of these areas there was always some old, abandoned human structure, like a forgotten settlement, an isolated cabin, or sometimes just ruins covered in years of vegetation. These were places where people used to live, but where they had all disappeared for unknown reasons. Nathaniel also said that in all the years he had spent hunting, in the mountains he would sometimes find things that belonged to travelers, like backpacks that had been left behind, torn clothes hanging from branches, and even personal papers or money lying around on the forest floor. He never did find bodies, though. That was really weird. Over the years, a lot of travelers have gone missing. There should be bones, remains, or some other physical proof of what happened to these people. There was nothing, though. It was like they stopped existing and were absorbed into the forest without being seen. What bothered the old hunter more than anything else was that there was no evidence at all. Thomas felt more and more uneasy as he listened to all of these stories. A part of him wanted to forget about what had happened, keep going west, and never think about those mountains again. But he also wanted to understand. This was the part of him that had always been stubborn and curious. He was interested in what he had seen being true. I couldn't just accept it. That humanoid predators were living in the forests of the Appalachians, and no one was doing anything about it. Thomas made a choice that would change the course of his life in the morning of his 6th day in Prestonburg. He changed his plans and decided to stay in the area instead of going west as he had planned. He wanted to find out the truth about what lived in those mountains. Dr. Morrison tried to talk him out of it by saying it would be crazy to go back to the place that almost killed him on purpose. But Thomas, He was young and determined, and the experience had changed him in some fashion. He couldn't just shrug it off and act like nothing happened. He thought he owed it to himself and maybe to all the other travelers who hadn't been able to get away. Thomas found work at a sawmill close to Prestonburg. It was hard work that didn't pay much, but it was enough to meet his basic needs. He spent all of his free time over the next few months telling stories about the mountains to anyone who would listen. They went to remote villages, talked to experienced trappers, and talked to people who had had strange experiences. Slowly, they started to put together a more complete picture of what was going on. He found out things that were even scarier than he thought they would be. The people who went missing happened a long time ago. They had been happening over and over for decades, maybe even hundreds of years. Old records in the county archives talked about whole families who moved to remote mountain areas and then stopped answering the mail or showing up to towns to get things and sell their goods. When someone finally went to check on the properties, they were empty, sometimes with signs of a quick departure, but most of the time with no sign of what had happened. Things like furniture, clothes, and food that had gone bad on tables were still there, as if the people who lived there had just disappeared in the middle of their daily activities. There was also always that unpleasant detail. 0 bodies were found. There were no signs of where the people had gone. Thomas also came across A. There is a geographic pattern to the disappearances. Most of them happened in a certain mountain belt that runs from southwestern West Virginia to eastern Kentucky and is about 100 meters long and 30 miles wide. This area was very far away and rough, with deep valleys and thick forests that were mostly unexplored until the early 1900s. The maps of the area were not very clear and were often wrong because they were based on guesses rather than surveys. It was the perfect place for something or someone to hide from others. Civilized world. In the winter of 1944-1955, Thomas met Daniel Fletcher. Fletcher was a former officer in the Kentucky State Militia who had served in the Civil War and then worked for the government as an investigator. Daniel was a tall, thin man in his early 60s. He had sharp gray eyes and a white beard that he kept very short. He retired a few years ago, but he still liked to look into unsolved crimes, especially ones that the police didn't want to look into. When Thomas told him, Daniel was amazed by what he had found and decided to help him with the investigation. Daniel could use things that Thomas wasn't able to. He knew people who were in charge in several counties, had experience investigating crimes, and had weapons and gear that would work for mountain trips. Daniel believed Thomas's story most of all. He had looked into missing persons cases in the area years before and came to the same conclusions about the something odd in those forests. They planned a trip to find out what was going on. The trip wouldn't be last minute and desperate like Thomas. The well-planned trip would include many people and enough food and gear to stay in the mountains for weeks. Daniel recruited 6 men for the trip in spring 1955. Besides Daniel and Thomas, 4 people were with him. Experienced 35-year-old hunter James McKinney. Robert Walsh wanted more accurate maps of the area. William Stone, a former Philippine soldier who was used to danger. Lexington's young reporter, Henry Carson, wanted to write about the mountain mystery. Everyone was warned of the area's dangers and strange stories. They all went anyway because, despite their different interests, they all wanted to solve a long-standing local mystery. Prestonburg was the departure point on a clear May morning when the mountains were green. They packed non-perishable food, camping gear, tools, weapons, a lot of ammunition, first aid supplies, and recording devices to keep track of everything they saw for 3 weeks. Robert Walsh brought mapping tools and blank notebooks, in-depth notes. Henry Carson carried a heavy camera, one of few nearby. He planned to take photos to prove what they found. The plan was to set up a base camp in the middle of the missing people area and slowly search. Nothing major happened in the first few days of the trip. They camped in open spaces, followed well-known paths, and kept at least 2 people awake at night to watch. Thomas saw a different forest this time of year than in the fall. There were many living things. Birds sang constantly. A squirrel ran through the trees. Some deer were grazing in the open. He struggled to reconcile this bright picture with his dark memories. The mood changed as they went deeper into the mountains, away from the main trails and into unexplored areas. Day 5, So there weren't many flat camping spots, Daniel chose a rise near the riverbank for his base camp to get a good view and make getting to the water easy. They pitched 3 large tents, built a kitchen, and ropes with bells formed a defensive perimeter that rang at night. No strange things happened that first valley night. The second night was quiet too, but at 2 a.m. on the third night, the outside bells started ringing. After waking up, everyone grabbed their weapons and left the tents. People could see around the camp because the moon was almost full. James McKinney, watching, duty, pointed to a 50-yard tree line. Something moved in the dark. It wasn't Pet. A person, or person-like thing, watched the camp. Daniel shouted, introducing himself and telling whoever it was to identify themselves. No response. A few seconds later, the figure slowly walked back into the forest darkness and disappeared. Men stayed awake and aware throughout. Nothing else happened that night. Daniel and James visited the figure's sunrise location. Their steps were marked in the soft ground near the tree. Something odd about these barefoot footprints. Uneven weight distribution made the person walk strangely. They stood on toes more than heels. That morning, the group discussed what happened and decided what to do. Was Henry Carson. He looked nervous, as he said it was one thing to hear about strange mountain people and another to see them. Former soldier William Stone remained calm and practical, suggesting a local hermit was watching the camp. Thomas knew better. He knew that posture and movement were fundamentally wrong. He was afraid of them for months. One of them, Daniel decided to systematically inspect the area with a partner to make it safer. Thomas and James were instructed to look upstream into the valley. Robert and Henry would map the mountain's west slope. Daniel and William stayed at camp to guard the perimeter and keep an eye out. All participants had to bring weapons and whistles and return to camp before dark in case of an emergency. We'd leave immediately if anyone didn't return by the agreed time. Looking for. Thomas and James followed the riverbank to begin their journey. Because it flowed over round, smooth stones, the water was surprisingly clear. The remains of a long-exhausted campfire, rusted metal pieces that could have been tools or weapons, and even the crumbling remains of a hut that was actually a few rotting logs covered in moss were sometimes found. James examined each find and tried to discover how long they've been missing. Most of them looked decades old, but it was hard to tell. They encountered something 3 miles up the river that stopped them. There was a village remnant. About 15 decaying buildings lined a single dirt road overgrown with plants. Some buildings collapsed, leaving rotting wood. Others had partially standing empty walls. Blind-eye windows watching people pass. A larger building stood in the village center. It looked like a church or community hall with a partially collapsed roof, but mostly intact walls. With their guns drawn, Thomas and James cautiously entered the empty settlement, listening for sounds and movements. Deep, unsettling silence existed. Sounds like no birds were singing. They searched better-preserved buildings and found things. A rusty pot, broken dishes, a rocking chair covered in spider webs, and loose pages from a damp book were left behind. One house unnerved James. The inside walls have scratch marks that look like someone tried hard to nail through the wood. After gathering the courage to enter, the larger building in town was scarier. The interior was dark and damp. Water enters through ceiling holes. Rows of wooden pews showed that it had been a church, but something terrible had happened. Dark spots on the inside walls looked like mold, but James realized they were probably old blood. Even stranger things were carved in wood. They saw no letters or words in their languages. They saw repetitive geometric patterns that hurt their eyes. Platform where preacher stands. Just reading would have preached. It was interesting because it was the only thing in the village that looked mostly preserved, like someone had taken extra care to protect it from the weather. Thomas carefully opened the yellowed book. English language diary with beautiful handwriting that deteriorated over time. The first entries, from 1872, discussed Hollow's founding. Creek by religious families seeking refuge from city problems. Reverend Josiah Blackwood's diary described the community's early years with optimism. As Thomas turned pages, the tone changed drastically. The Reverend wrote about scary forest experiences in August 1873. Residents reported seeing figures watching them from the trees. The figures looked like people from afar, but weren't. They behaved strangely when no one was watching. The Reverend initially thought the sightings were just nervous people or overactive imaginations, but they kept happening and became more common. A child disappeared while playing near the village's edge in October. No one found her after days of searching. Missing people increased over the following months. Someone went hunting and never returned. 2 women who went to the river for water are missing. A very old man sleeping. He was found in his home with his bed empty and the door open one morning, despite neighbors locking it from the outside the night before. The Reverend wrote increasingly hopelessly about how he couldn't protect his community from something they couldn't understand or fight. As the Reverend quoted Bible verses about demons and divine trials, the entries became less logical, wondering if they were being punished for a sin they didn't know. March was the last diary entry. In 1874, writing was hard to read because the letters were big and shaky, like someone was shaking hands. He wrote he was last. The others had vanished or fled to the mountains, where they likely died. He recounted how they had knocked on his door the night before, calling his name and those he had loved and lost. He heard voices beyond the door, but he knew they weren't his family or friends. They were flawed copies trying to. Faces. May God have mercy on any soul that has been touched by the devil faces. May God have mercy on any soul that crosses these mountains, for they are always hungry for more. James looked pale after reading the notes over Thomas's shoulder. They looked at each other quietly, knowing their discovery was crucial. The whole village was. The mountain creature that ate them was still hunting and collecting victims after many years. It took Thomas a while to pack the diary. It may have been the best proof of what happened in those woods. It had to be returned to camp and then to the police. They were extra cautious as they walked around the village after leaving the broken-down church, in a house near the edge. James found something that nearly made him scream. The floor of a back room had bones partially buried in trash and leaves. Those were human bones. That much was obvious, but they were arranged in a strange, almost decorative spiral, like someone had put them there on purpose. James was an experienced hunter who saw blood and animals die. No, this was different. The arrangement was upsetting and seemed strategic. Motive for an animal predator act. Thomas imagined the scene and took a picture. He missed Henry Carson and his camera. Still, they didn't touch the bones or stay long. My sense of being watched was worse than before. Both felt watched from behind. After watching them, they decided to return to camp and tell everyone what they saw. They quickly left Hollow Creek and returned south on the river. They always looked back to make sure no one was following. The camp appeared in the distance as the sun set. They felt better with Daniel and William present. Robert and Henry returned from Western Slope exploration soon after. Thomas and James shared their discovery around the campfire that night. The audience was quiet as Thomas read Reverend Blackwood's diary, preacher's sad predictions about his community's end. Robert and Henry didn't find anything exciting while exploring. They found more ancient and abandoned human remains. They agreed that the forest had a creepy, unexplained quality, like something was wrong with the land. Daniel spoke after listening to the story with his mind elsewhere. He said he was considering an explanation. He was experiencing things that seemed crazy. Daniel believed a group lived in the mountains miles from others. It was their home for generations, possibly centuries. Being alone for a long time and doing things he didn't want to talk about may have caused serious physical and mental decline. These people had become predators and were pursuing lone travelers for food, or worse, what they could copy. Faces and voices indicated a preserved intelligence twisted and used for evil. They were human, but they were so different from most people that they seemed other. William Stone saw things differently. He had seen isolated tribes in the Philippines do cruel or incomprehensible things. He suggested these mountains were home to an ancient culture. Pre-Native Americans were called Native Americans, a culture that had learned to avoid outside contact and had developed sophisticated ways to kill visitors. They needn't be supernatural, but they're good at hiding and covering up evidence. Henry Carson, a journalist, focused on solutions rather than ideas. Found information. He said they had enough evidence. The Reverend's diary proved Hollow Creek's tragedy. They should immediately return to civilization, give the police the diary, and plan a larger official expedition with dozens of armed men to investigate and possibly eliminate any danger in those mountains. Thomas felt it was suicide to explore with only 6 men, differently. These things attacked him, but he survived. He had spent months investigating the mystery and was closer to the truth than in decades. He partially agreed with Henry that leaving immediately was smart. However, his stubborn and curious side wanted to continue. He sought these things home. He wanted to see them. He needed to comprehend them before leaving the mountains. Daniel mostly concurred. Thomas, this expedition took a lot of time and energy, and now they only have an old journal. It may not be enough to get the authorities to act. They agreed after much discussion. They would cautiously explore the area for 3 more days in groups of at least 3. They wouldn't pair up. If they found something solid, like where these animals lived, they would carefully record it. As soon as possible, then plan an official response. If they found nothing new or something dangerous, they would end the expedition immediately. Henry didn't like this choice, but stayed 3 more days. 2 men stayed awake and kept a double watch that night. Night moved slowly. While on guard, Thomas and Robert heard forest sounds around 3 a.m. These were unusual nighttime sounds. Beasts. In the dark, away from the fire, those sounds were human or human-like voices. 10 or more voices circled the camp but stayed away. A clear English voice occasionally stood out. Thomas heard a woman say, "Help, please help me," and a child say, "I'm lost. Where are my parents?" He knew he was in the right place. Traps prevented people from returning to the camp. Robert and he silently woke the others by not answering the voices. 6 men stared into the darkness with their guns drawn. For almost an hour, the voices tried different words, emotions, and pleases. When it became clear no one would be swayed, voices stopped. Something about the silence after the voices scared me more. Bin. The silence was tense, as if something was patiently waiting outside the light, knowing people would make mistakes. Nobody slept that night. They found something terrifying when the sun rose and lit up the forest. The security perimeter was slowly dismantled at night. After several cuts, the bell ropes were quietly removed. Someone did this within a few meters, concealed the camp, and carefully broke down its defenses. It demonstrated their strength and implied they could attack at will. They may have been playing, testing, or studying their prey before attacking. Daniel quit the expedition immediately. Plan for 3 extra days was irrelevant. Things were too risky. They didn't trust sophistication enough. Number of people they dealt with. They had to leave while it was still light and easy to see. They quickly left camp, taking only what they needed and leaving behind heavier items that would slow them down. They planned to move quickly along the river to safer, more populated areas and not stop. From a gear tent, William Stone shouted to the others, nearly ready to leave. He found something in his backpack. It was something they didn't have when they camped. Simple dolls were made of twigs tied together with human hair and had small stone eyes. It looked like an old shirt was ripped around it. The doll's simplicity disturbed me. The group was most alarmed by what they saw closer. Each hair strand used to tie the branches was different color and feel. Black hair, blonde hair, you have red and gray hair. Their hairs likely came from many victims over the years. The doll was a message, like removing weapons from the perimeter. It showed that they were always watched, that their defenses were useless, and that their lives depended on whatever lived in those mountains being tolerant for a while. Henry Carson wanted to throw away the doll, but Daniel insisted on keeping it as proof. More evidence of their foe. They finished packing quickly and ran away in a tight formation, each man looking around with his gun drawn. Returning was terrifying. Though they didn't see anything, they felt followed. Sometimes a figure appeared among the distant trees and then vanished. They occasionally heard movement in their direction, but couldn't see it. It was obvious they were being watched as they were led away like unwanted guests. The message was obvious. You can leave now, but won't return. They walked non-stop all day. They ate and drank from streams without stopping. As night fell, they were exhausted but still in the forest, far from towns and safety. They stayed in camp another night. They found an open area near a rocky cliff for partial safety. They pitched a big tent to keep everyone together. They set up shifts with 3 men awake and lit a big fire. There were no safety illusions. They'd probably die if attacked, but they'd be prepared. Night had been long for them. The voices returned louder and in greater numbers. They called, pleaded, threatened, and tempted throughout camp. Someone called Daniel by name, like Daniel's late wife. While making breaks, William heard the voice of a Philippine soldier who died. Thomas heard a 15-year-old lullaby from his mother. He lost his mother as a child. Thomas cried as he heard that voice sing in the dark. Though he knew it was a cruel copy, the accuracy was so painful. What did they know about his mother? How could they precisely copy his song? Had only heard as a child. The scariest answer was that they might not have known, but they were reading him, judging his reactions, and imitating him based on small cues he wasn't aware he was sending. They were smart predators who had become adept at exploiting emotional weaknesses over generations. The CCtographer, Robert Walsh, was most upset. He couldn't stop shaking and swearing. He rocked on his knees with his arms around them. Stress was causing him to lose his mind. James McKinney sat next to him and spoke softly to keep him in the real world. But when dead people called their names from across the fire, it was hard to stay normal. Daniel began reading aloud childhood stories about his battles and travels. He behaved like the respected officer he was decades earlier. Attended. Others were distracted by his steady voice from the dark voices. Voices changed around midnight. They sang together instead of pursuing the men individually. They heard dozens of voices singing an old song they didn't know. A haunting chorus, the words were unknown in English or any other language. It was simpler and older. It was hard to focus because the singing was hypnotic. Organize your thoughts. William Stone's hands covered his ears, but the sound bounced around his head. Henry Carson was frantically writing everything in his notebook, as if recording everything was the only thing keeping him sane. The chanting continued for hours, with the volume and beat fluctuating. It sometimes sounded too loud to be from throats. Sometimes it faded. Everyone heard a scarier whisper than screams. It stopped long before dawn, leaving silence. 6 exhausted men couldn't sleep. They awaited dawn to end this nightmare for a few hours. When it was light enough, they left again. Due to his poor health, others carried Robert Walsh. He was deep in thought, and a few direct questions were answered. 2 men helped him walk while others watched, moving slowly but steadily. As they approached familiar mountain areas, it became less uncomfortable to feel watched. The figures following them seemed to be falling behind because they didn't want to get close to people. After 2 days out of the valley, they reached a well-worn, map-remembered path. Jenkins, a village with help and rides, was less than 10 miles away. Relief was almost palpable. They camped again, this time along the trail in an open area with a clear view. None spoke to them that night. No people were visible in the dark. They seemed to have crossed an invisible line that these things had never crossed before. The next day, they visited. Jenkins in the afternoon, a group of dirty, tired, traumatized men. Robert Walsh was hospitalized immediately. The local doctor found him in shock and said he needed specialized care that wasn't available in such a small town. He was admitted to a larger city hospital for 3 months to recover mentally. He would never recover and fear for the rest of his short life. Woods and darkness. The other 5 men rested in Jenkins for a few days before deciding what to do with their findings. Daniel Fletcher stole Reverend Blackwood's diary, the scary doll, and Henry Carson's county police notes. He requested a meeting with the sheriff, local judge, and any other powerful person who would listen. He became increasingly angry at the lack of interest and doubt. The sheriff quickly reviewed the diary and found it intriguing. They advised Daniel to donate it to a museum because it was historical and not current. The doll was dismissed as a child's plaything or superstitious settlers' attempt to ward off evil spirits in an abandoned cabin decades earlier. Daniel kept telling them about the voices in the dark, the people following them, and the security perimeter being disarmed, but they were politely condescending but didn't believe him. The local authorities didn't want to send expensive and risky expeditions to investigate mountain myths. Real problems arose immediately. There were property disputes, violent crimes between neighbors, and coal mining issues growing in the area. We didn't need to send men into the mountains to find savage cannibals, as Daniels claimed. Henry Carson had more. He had some success publishing a story about his experiences in Lexington after returning. His editor was interested, but only in a heavily edited and sensationalized version that read like Gothic fiction rather than investigative journalism. A magazine with strange stories and unsolved mysteries published the article. A few hundred people read it, but most found it funny rather than serious. Henry was disappointed, but fortunately the story was recorded so anyone could read it again. Thomas Harlan stayed in Jenkins for a few weeks after everyone left because he wasn't sure what to do. He completely forgot his first trip. He no longer liked going west or building railroads. His mountain experience changed him deeply. He had frequent nightmares of rigid figures and his mother singing in the dark. Their smiles extended beyond their empty eyes as they approached him. The man slept poorly, ate little, and spent most of his time alone thinking about his past. Thomas met Sarah Mitchell on a long Jenkins walk alone. The young teacher had moved to the area a few months earlier to work at a rural school. Sarah kept seeing the troubled young man walking alone, so she approached him and talked about everyday things. Thomas initially resisted, but they eventually enjoyed these interactions. He felt more grounded in real life after talking to Sarah, who was calm and normal. Over several weeks they became friends, and then more. Thomas told Sarah the entire mountain incident before telling anyone else on the trip. He anticipated doubt and fear. Sarah just listened, asked questions to make sure she understood, and said something. Shocked him. She concurred. Her family lived in a populated area, but she had heard stories like that her whole life. Her grandmother warned kids not to go alone into the deepest mountains, never to answer forest calls, and to return before dark. Warnings were passed down through generations. Though many laughed at them as superstitions, some always paid attention. Seriously, because they knew someone who went missing or returned changed. Thomas and Sarah married in spring 1966 at Jenkins's small church. As expected, Daniel Fletcher brought bad news to the wedding. After trying everything, he planned an official expedition. The state wouldn't investigate, and the feds hadn't responded to his letters. Someone accepted Reverend Blackwood's diary. A Louisville Historical Society cataloged and stored this record along with hundreds of others about Appalachian pioneer settlements. Many forgot about it, but it was kept. One of many intriguing historical facts. James McKinney, the group's hunter, attended the wedding. After the trip, he had returned to the mountain several times, but never as far. He kept finding strange footprints and other signs of a presence. Animals avoided abandoned buildings with disturbing markings, but he knew the safe territory and never crossed it. He knew that exploring dangerous parts of the mountains would only lead to disaster. James was more gentle with the forest. Instead of a resource, he saw it as a living thing that needed care. To visit family, William Stone returned to Ohio. Soon after the expedition, they didn't want to discuss it. He politely declined the wedding invitation in writing, saying he had moved on from that part of his life. Although Henry Carson was working in Lexington, he sent his congratulations and a copy of the magazine that published his article. Robert Walsh was out of the hospital and living with distant relatives, but neither of them had heard from him. Due to his trauma, he rarely left the house. Thomas and Sarah moved to Jenkins, where Thomas worked at a hardware store and saved enough money to start a small business selling tools to miners and farmers. He tried to live normally by focusing on the present. He and Sarah had 2 girls and a boy over the next few years. Thomas was a loving but overprotective father who never let his kids go far. They were left alone at home and told to return before dark, and about the deep woods dangers. Sarah understood Thomas's concerns and agreed with his strict rules, even when her older children complained about being treated like toddlers. However, Thomas would never forget his ordeal. Nightmares continued, but less frequently. Some quiet nights he would wake up in a cold sweat from a dream about. He heard voices calling his kids' names and saw stiff figures walking around his house. Before bed, he locked all doors and windows several times. Even in the nicest parts of Kentucky, he felt unsafe, so he hid a loaded gun around the house. Sarah never criticized these oddities. She married an experienced man and didn't mind his hidden scars. Years passed. The Jenkins area grew. Coal mining expanded rapidly. More people arrived. More settlements appeared. More roads passed through this mountain area. The Appalachians' wilderness areas shrank as you went deeper. As population grew and industrialization accelerated, disappearances became less common or less noticeable. Easy explanations for missing people existed now. Mine accidents, river drownings, and, without notice, to seek better opportunities elsewhere. Thomas received an unexpected letter in 1923, almost 20 years after his trip. Dr. Edmund Pierce, a young Boston Business School researcher, sent it. Dr. Pierce was researching mountainous U.S. disappearances and found references to Henry Carson's article from years ago. He wanted to talk to people who had first-hand knowledge of the topics covered. He went to Kentucky that summer and wanted to talk to Thomas about his life. The well-written, polite letter took the issue seriously for the first time in the local government's history. Thomas deliberated before responding. He wanted to ignore the letter and move on because thinking about those bad times would hurt and be pointless. What could a Boston professor do about something the state government ignored? But another part, the stubborn part of Thomas who had never given up on answers, saw an opening. A college-educated, wealthy person could finally address the issue. It may save lives after this. Thomas told Sarah, and Sarah told him to speak up. She suggested that telling someone who cared about the situation might help him feel better after carrying this burden alone for so long. Thomas answered thoroughly and agreed to meet Dr. Pierce there. In summer 1923, the researcher visited Jenkins. He was thin, in his early 30s, wore thick glasses, and carried a briefcase full of papers, maps, and note-taking tools. He used a new mechanical recorder to record every word he said to Thomas for 3 days. Thomas discussed everything from his first mountain trip to his Daniel trip. Fletcher described every detail, no matter how upsetting. Dr. Pierce listened and asked questions to help Thomas understand, but mostly he let him talk. Dr. Pierce said something shocking to the older man after Thomas finished. He received over 40 similar reports from Georgia to Pennsylvania and the Appalachians. Patterns were too regular to be a coincidence or group endeavor. True events occurred in mountains affected many people for a long time. These reports were being compiled into an academic study by Dr. Pierce for publication. This would finally attract scientists interested in the phenomenon. He believed good records and careful research could persuade the authorities to investigate. Thomas felt so accepted that he almost cried. After 20 years of being mocked as strange or superstitious, he told many people his story, and finally an academic took it seriously. Dr. Pierce promised to send Thomas his study when it was published and update him on any changes. As they parted, they hoped Appalachia's dark secrets would be revealed. Thomas never received the promised study after months. He never heard from Boston University after sending several letters. He finally wrote out of worry, directly to the university's anthropology department for Dr. Edmund Pierce information. He received a brief, formal response. Dr. Pierce disappeared during a West Virginia mountain research trip in October 1923. No sign of him was found after a search. An empty briefcase was found on a trail. He left with his papers, recordings, and notes. No one had solved the case, and the university was sad about a bright student's death. Thomas, I received this news with shock and resignation. He knew what happened. Due to his mountainous travels and invisible line crossing, Dr. Pierce has been brought before many people. He left with all his evidence and event documentation. A mountain creature seemed to be killing anyone who got too close to the truth to keep it from spreading. Thomas Harland lived long. He died naturally at 72 in 1953. He was famous in Jenkins as the old man who told strange mountain stories to anyone who would listen. Most people tolerated him and thought his stories were exaggerated folk tales due to his memory loss. Some people always paid more attention, especially those who lived deep in the Appalachians and had strange experiences. For these few, Thomas's words, not fun, but reminders. Thomas asked his youngest son, Thomas, to be with him as he died. The old man was weak. Though his breathing was difficult, his mind was clear. He spoke to his son in new ways. He said he had been afraid for 50 years, always looking over his shoulder because he thought the mountain things would finish what they started. He explained how every disappearance, Over the years, the newspaper articles about him bothered him because he knew he could have done more to get authorities' attention. The most important thing Thomas did was warn his son about the mountains. He claimed that old things lived in those mountains regardless of civilization, roads, or cities. These existed before European settlers and likely would continue to do so. People left. He said these things were patient, adaptable, and dangerous to anyone foolish enough to enter their territory alone. He made his son swear that he would never let his grandchildren or their children go deep into the mountains alone or without knowing the dangers. Though he wasn't sure he believed his father, Thomas's son promised this. It was hard hearing about. In 1953, with cars, TV, and scientific progress, predatory humanoid creatures were hard to take seriously. The nightmares he still had as an old man made him realize his father was scared. That convinced him to heed the warning and warn others. With family by his side, Thomas died that night. Only Sarah, who was alive and sitting next to his bed, heard his last whispers. "Of course," he said, "they're still there in the depths. They always will be." Thomas Harlan died decades ago. Modern Appalachians have changed a lot. Some wild areas now have marked trails, supervised campsites, and cell phone signals. Millions of people hike, camp, and enjoy nature in the Appalachians each year. Most return home safely with beautiful memories of their wilderness experience, but people go into the mountains alone and never return, as if they vanished. In remote areas, organized searches still find no trace of lost people, as if they disappeared. Eastern Kentucky is home to Thomas Harlan's descendants. They have his last-year journal, which documented everything he saw and learned about the mountains. There have been several attempts to publish or promote it without success. Modern authorities say that most people who go missing in the wilderness have normal reasons, such as getting lost and dying in the elements, having an accident in dangerous terrain, or committing suicide or running away from their problems. No need for strange explanations when normal ones will do, they say. The story's readers don't believe this. Read Thomas's diary or hear similar stories from other sources to know there's more. The disappearances follow unusual patterns and occur at statistically unlikely rates in certain areas. Experiences with humanoid figures that move randomly, imitate voices, and seem to hunt lone travelers have occurred decades and hundreds of miles apart. Whole communities disappeared in mountainous settlements for unknown reasons. Louisville Historical Society archives contain Reverend Josiah Blackwood's diary. Anyone can request it, but few do. After Daniel Fletcher died, the twig and hair doll was lost or thrown away. The recordings of Dr. Edmund Pierce's interview with Thomas were lost. The passed-down stories and writings were mostly ignored as historical curiosity rather than warnings. But the mountains remain. Despite modern society's progress, millions of acres of Appalachian forests remain unexplored. There are unexplored caves kilometers underground and deep valleys few people visit. Even experienced animals act strangely in some places. Listening to local stories and talking to people who have lived in remote areas for generations will still warn you not to go alone into the deep mountains, not to answer voices calling your name in the dark, not to accept help from strangers who offer shelter out of the blue. Thomas Harlan received these warnings in the Bluefield Tavern in 1904. Because they think modern technology and reason protect them, some travelers ignore these warnings after years of travel. However, the mountains haven't changed as much as we think. Some places are still darker and quieter than they should be, and something old watches and waits for lone travelers who cross them. Thomas Harlan's story reminds us of world mysteries we ignore. It also warns that human arrogance, the belief that we have mastered nature and eliminated all dangers, can be fatal. It's proof that old stories we dismiss as superstition may contain truths we risk ignoring. Keep these in mind when hiking. Remember Thomas' tale. Listen for the forest's warning signs, such as sudden bird silence, a lack of animals, and a feeling of being watched that raises your neck hairs. Remember what the old man said in the tavern. Don't answer or investigate if you hear voices calling out in the dark that sound like people you know pleading with you. Leave. Hunting, waiting, and hunger persist in the Appalachian Mountains. They remain patient and deadly after 100 years. Thomas Harlan learned this the hard way and spent his life warning others. His story, and those of all the people who have gone missing in those mountains, should be remembered and taken seriously because maybe, just maybe, if more people paid attention, people would disappear less in the deep mountain shadows if warned. Maybe the animals there would starve and leave forever. Without that, the mountains will always be dangerous for those who don't respect their darkest secrets. If this story touched you or made you reconsider going into remote areas alone, it worked. For more disturbing author stories, subscribe to the channel. Comment with your strange remote experiences or what you thought of this story. Share this video with someone who likes unsolved mysteries and historical mysteries. More people knowing these stories will help them spot danger. Stay safe, especially if you're going to the mountains. Until next time.